Hunter rescued a trapped pregnant bear in a snowstorm, and then she did the unbelievable. The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying with it the sharp sting of ice and regret. Liam Cole pulled his coat tighter around his body, the leather worn and weathered from years of exposure to Montana's brutal winters. He had walked these woods for most of his life, moving like a shadow between the trees. His rifle had once been an extension of his own hand. The hunt had always been simple: find, track, kill. There was no room for hesitation, no place for guilt. But that was before the nightmares had started, before the faces of the creatures he had taken haunted his every step. Now, as he trudged through the snow, each boot crunching against the frozen earth, he felt a weight far heavier than the rifle that no longer hung at his back. Something caught his eye, a dark shape slumped against the endless white. Liam's breath hitched as he moved closer, the bitter wind swirling snow around the form. A bear. At first he thought it was dead, but then he saw the slow rise and fall of her rib cage. Her massive body lay unnaturally still, her head resting against the snow, her breath coming in ragged puffs of steam. Then he saw the snare. The cruel iron teeth had clamped around her hind leg, tearing through thick fur and flesh. Blood stained the snow beneath her, a stark contrast against the white. Liam had once set many traps like this, back when he thought survival meant taking without question. But now, staring into the suffering in the bear's dull eyes, he felt something crack deep inside him. The bear stirred weakly, her massive paws shifting slightly, but she didn't try to rise. She couldn't. Hunger had hollowed her out, and the wound had stolen what little strength remained. Liam knew better than to get too close. A bear, even wounded, was still a force of nature, capable of tearing a man apart. But she didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She simply watched him. His fingers hovered over the knife at his belt. He could end her suffering. A quick, clean strike. A mercy. That was what the old Liam would have done. But as he crouched beside her, something inside him rebelled against the thought. He had taken too many lives. Perhaps this was his chance to give one back. Carefully, he reached for the snare. The metal was ice cold beneath his gloves, the rusted mechanism stiff from exposure. The bear twitched but didn't resist. He worked quickly, his breath shallow as he pried the iron jaws apart. The moment the trap snapped open, the bear let out a deep, shuddering exhale. She tried to move, but her leg buckled beneath her, and she collapsed back into the snow. Liam hesitated. This was the moment he should leave. Nature would take its course, and she would either heal or die. That was the way of things. But he couldn't move. He could see the outline of her ribs beneath her thick coat, the way her stomach had hollowed from days, maybe weeks without food. His hands clenched. Against every instinct, he stood and turned back the way he had come. The old Liam would have left without a second thought. But Liam wasn't that man anymore. That night, he returned with a slab of deer meat. He had no illusions that the bear would still be there. She should have dragged herself away, disappearing into the wilderness as soon as she was free. But when he reached the clearing, she was still there, her breathing shallow, her eyes barely open. He kept his distance, tossing the meat a few feet from her. At first, she didn't move. Then slowly, painfully, she lifted her head and sniffed the air. A flicker of life returned to her gaze. He left before she could decide whether to trust him or not. For 3 days, Liam returned. Each time, he found her still lying there, though the meat he left behind was always gone. Her leg remained swollen, the deep wound sluggish to heal, but she was growing stronger. On the 4th day, she was sitting up when he arrived. A warning rumbled deep in her chest, a reminder of what she was. Liam stopped several feet away, setting down a fresh cut of venison before backing away. The bear watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. He half expected her to charge, to finally decide he was a threat, but she didn't. Instead, she lowered her massive head and began to eat. The storm came on the 7th night. Liam had spent his life reading the land, and the signs had been clear. The sudden stillness in the air, the way the trees stood frozen in eerie silence. By the time the first flakes began to fall, he was already pulling on his heaviest coat, gathering supplies. The bear's den was half a mile from the clearing, nestled at the base of a rocky outcrop. He had tracked her scent there the day before, confirming what he already suspected. She was too weak to travel far. By the time he reached the den, the wind had become a living thing, shrieking through the trees, turning the world into a blinding flurry of white. He nearly missed it. The entrance was buried beneath a thick drift of snow, untouched, no sign of movement. A sharp pang of fear lanced through him. If she was trapped inside, she would suffocate before morning. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and began to dig. The cold bit into his fingers, even through his gloves, but he didn't stop. Snow poured into his boots. The wind clawed at his face, but he kept digging. After what felt like an eternity, his hand broke through into the den. Warm, damp air rushed out, carrying the scent of earth and fur. He pulled his flashlight from his belt, angling it into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the rough walls of the den. Then, movement. A shape shifted in the shadows and his breath caught in his throat. The bear was alive, but she was not alone. Nestled against her massive body, barely visible beneath the thick fur, were two tiny forms, cubs. Liam stared, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. He had expected to find a dying bear, to perhaps offer what little aid he could before leaving her to fate. But this was something else entirely. This was new life, fragile and impossibly small against the vast, merciless wild. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had saved them. Slowly he backed away, careful not to disturb the entrance he had just uncovered. The wind howled around him, but he barely felt it. For the first time in years, Liam Cole felt something other than regret. He felt hope. Liam stood outside the den, the storm raging around him. Yet all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. The sight of the cubs, nestled against their mother's body, had unraveled something inside him, something raw and unfamiliar. He had spent years taking life, never pausing to consider the weight of what he was doing, and yet here he was, standing in the middle of a snowstorm, protecting a creature he once would have hunted without a second thought. He backed away slowly, ensuring the entrance to the den remained open, the cold biting into his exposed skin. The wind howled through the trees, sending a spray of ice and snow against his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with a single thought: survival. Not just for himself, but for them. He turned and made his way back toward his cabin, his steps slow and heavy as the storm threatened to swallow him whole. Each movement felt deliberate, each breath a battle against the elements. By the time he reached the safety of his small wooden shelter, his body was numb, exhaustion weighing on him like a lead blanket. Inside, he set to work immediately, pulling out supplies he had stored away for emergencies. He had enough dried meat to last him a few weeks, but the bear needed fresh food, something she could digest without using too much energy. His mind raced through possibilities. Hunting in this weather was nearly impossible, but there were traps he had set miles away, long before he had decided to abandon that way of life. He debated with himself for a long moment before finally giving in. If he wanted her to survive, if he wanted those cubs to have a chance, he would have to use every skill he had, even those he wished to forget. The next morning, the storm had calmed, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. Liam rose before the sun, slipping his knife and rifle into place, though he knew he wouldn't use them unless absolutely necessary. He moved through the forest like a ghost, his instincts guiding him through the familiar paths until he reached the first trap. A rabbit, frozen stiff in the cold, its small body lifeless. He exhaled slowly, feeling that familiar pang of guilt, but he knew there was no other choice. He collected what he could, moving swiftly from one trap to the next, until he had enough to last the bear for another few days. When he returned to the den, he was careful to approach slowly, making sure not to startle her. She was awake this time, her dark eyes locked onto him the moment he appeared. The cubs were still pressed against her belly, their tiny bodies barely shifting with each breath. Liam crouched a few feet away and tossed the fresh kill toward her. She didn't move at first, her gaze flickering between him and the offering in the snow. Then cautiously, she reached forward, her powerful jaws closing around the rabbit. He watched as she ate, her movements slow but steady, her body still weak but stronger than it had been days ago. The cubs stirred slightly at the scent of blood, their tiny paws pressing against her fur as she finished her meal. Liam remained still, waiting, unsure of what to expect. He had no illusions that she trusted him. Trust was something that took time, and time was something the wild rarely gave. But as she licked the last remnants of meat from her muzzle, she did something that sent a shiver down his spine. She lifted her head and looked at him, truly looked at him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something else entirely. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid that the moment would break. Then, as if satisfied, she lowered her head once more, curling protectively around her cubs. Liam swallowed hard and took a slow step back. That was all the invitation he needed to know he could return. The days bled into one another, each one colder than the last. Liam kept his distance but never failed to bring food. He checked the traps daily, making sure he had enough to keep them fed. And though he never ventured too close, he always saw her waiting, always felt the weight of her gaze as he left his offerings in the snow. The cubs grew stronger, their tiny cries filling the air whenever their mother shifted too far from them. It was a sound Liam never expected to find comforting, yet he did. It reminded him that life could still exist in a place as unforgiving as this. As time passed, the bear began to move more freely. She no longer lay still for hours on end, no longer seemed on the brink of collapse. One morning as Liam approached the den, he saw her standing for the first time. His breath caught in his throat as he watched her stretch, her massive frame shaking off the stiffness of weeks spent recovering. The cubs clung to her fur, their tiny forms wobbling as they attempted to mimic her movements. Liam felt an unexpected sense of pride, as though he had played some part in their survival, though he knew nature had done most of the work. He placed the food down as always, but this time, instead of waiting for him to leave, she took a step forward. His muscles tensed, every instinct telling him to retreat, but he didn't. He remained still as she slowly closed the distance between them, her nose twitching as she took in his scent. The air between them felt impossibly heavy, the silence stretching on until finally, she stopped just a few feet away. For the first time, Liam saw her up close, the scars along her muzzle, the faded streaks of fur where the trap had torn into her leg, the sheer power she possessed despite her weakened state. And yet she wasn't threatening him. She was studying him, the same way he had studied her. He didn't move, didn't speak, only watched as she exhaled one last time before turning back to her cubs. It was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging him, the closest she had ever come to trust. Liam released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and stepped back. He knew now that he could no longer think of her as just another bear, just another creature in the wild. She was something more. She was survival. She was resilience. And in some strange, unexplainable way, she was a reflection of himself. As he made his way back to his cabin, he felt something shift within him, something he had thought long buried. For the first time in years, Liam Cole felt as though he was exactly where he was meant to be. The wind had softened, no longer screaming through the trees but whispering instead, a hushed conversation between the branches. The snow had settled thick against the land, an undisturbed blanket of white stretching out before Liam as he made his way back to the den. His breath curled in the crisp morning air, his steps deliberate, each one sinking deep into the frozen ground. He carried more food today, knowing the mother bear would need to eat more if she was to keep her strength up. The cubs were growing fast, their tiny bodies stronger with each passing day, and that meant her need to provide for them would only increase. Liam knew that in the wild, only the fiercest survived, and despite her recovery, she was still vulnerable. The wolves would come, the bitter cold would not relent, and spring was still too far away to offer salvation. He arrived at the den to find the mother bear standing just outside, the cubs nestled close against her legs. It was the first time she had left the warmth of the burrow since giving birth, and Liam felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Pride, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, something more dangerous. He didn't want to feel attached, didn't want to care too much, but the sight of her, standing there, alive despite everything, stirred something undeniable in his chest. She watched him approach, her dark eyes sharp, unreadable, but not hostile. The cubs, on the other hand, were still too young to know fear. One of them, the slightly larger of the two, took an unsteady step forward, its tiny paws sinking into the snow. The mother made a low sound in the back of her throat, a warning, but the cub ignored it, stumbling awkwardly toward Liam. He froze. His fingers tightened around the bundle of meat he carried, his muscles tensing as the cub came closer. The mother bear remained still, her ears twitching, her body poised, but she did not lunge, did not bare her teeth. Liam's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The cub sniffed the air, its tiny nose twitching, and then, without hesitation, it pressed its small, warm body against his boot. Liam exhaled sharply, barely daring to move. The cub let out a small, curious sound, its bright, innocent eyes peering up at him. He swallowed. Slowly, carefully, he crouched, lowering himself to the cub's level. The mother let out another deep, rumbling noise, and Liam knew he was dangerously close to pushing whatever fragile understanding they had built too far. But then the cub did something unexpected. It batted at the laces of his boot, its tiny claws catching in the worn leather. A sound escaped him, something close to a chuckle but rougher, unfamiliar. The mother bear shifted her weight but did not move to stop them. Liam slowly extended his free hand, palm up, letting the cub sniff him if it wanted to. But before it could, the mother let out a sharp huff, and the cub immediately pulled away, scampering clumsily back to the safety of her massive frame. Liam exhaled, relieved and slightly disappointed all at once. He placed the food down in the snow and took a step back, giving them space. The mother wasted no time in claiming it, her powerful jaws closing around the fresh meat as she dragged it closer to her cubs. The little ones mewled eagerly, their tiny bodies pressing against her as she fed. Liam watched them for a moment longer before turning away. He knew when to leave. Days passed in the same careful rhythm. The mother bear grew stronger and the cubs became bolder. The smaller of the two, a female, remained cautious, always watching from the safety of her mother's side. But the larger cub, the adventurous one, was different. He took to following Liam's movements, his curiosity outweighing whatever instinct should have told him to be wary. Liam found himself looking forward to their interactions, despite knowing how dangerous it was to let himself grow attached. The land did not care for sentimentality. The wolves came at dusk. Liam had been outside tending to the firewood behind his cabin when he heard them. The eerie chorus of their howls drifted through the trees, a haunting melody carried by the wind. His blood turned to ice. He knew what they were hunting. He grabbed his rifle without thinking, his body already moving before his mind had fully caught up. The den was half a mile away, and he ran the distance without hesitation, the snow dragging at his boots, his breath burning in his lungs. By the time he reached the clearing, he saw them, 6 wolves, their lean, hungry bodies circling the entrance to the bear's den. The mother bear was standing protectively over her cubs, her fur bristling, her massive body a wall between them and the threat. But she was still weak, and the wolves knew it. Liam didn't stop to think. He raised his rifle and fired into the air, the shot splitting the silence like a crack of thunder. The wolves startled, their yellow eyes snapping toward him, their bodies tensing. He fired again, closer this time, and one of them let out a sharp yelp, the bullet burying itself into the snow just inches from its paws. That was enough. They turned one by one, melting back into the trees, their hunger momentarily overpowered by caution. Liam stood there panting, his rifle still raised, his pulse hammered in his ears. Slowly he lowered the weapon and turned his gaze to the mother bear. She was still watching him, her breath coming in heavy puffs, her body coiled tight with tension. The cubs were huddled close, their tiny forms trembling from the commotion. Liam took a slow step back. He had done what he could. Whether she saw him as an ally or just another danger was not for him to decide. But then, as he turned to leave, something remarkable happened. The mother bear let out a low, steady exhale and sat down. Not out of exhaustion, not out of defeat, but something else entirely. Liam paused, his heart pounding. She had accepted his presence, not as a threat, not as a hunter, but as something else. He swallowed hard and gave her one last look before heading back toward his cabin. He had never believed in second chances, never thought himself deserving of one. But as he moved through the frozen landscape, the weight in his chest felt lighter than it had in years. he had spent so long taking from this land. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found a way to give something back. The days bled together, winter holding the land in an unrelenting grip. But something had changed. The mother bear no longer saw Liam as a threat. She watched him, yes, with those dark, intelligent eyes. But there was no more hesitation, no more lingering tension in her stance. The cubs, growing stronger by the day, had begun to leave the den in short bursts, testing their legs in the thick snow, their clumsy movements almost comical. The larger cub, the curious one, would often wander too far, stumbling over drifts and swiping at the world like it was some great mystery waiting to be unraveled. The mother always led him to a point before calling him back with a deep, guttural sound, one he obeyed without question. Liam knew what she was doing. She was preparing them. Winter would not last forever, and when the time came, they would have to leave this place, have to learn how to survive without him bringing food, without the safety of this fragile truce they had unknowingly built. He told himself he was ready for that day, but he knew it was a lie. Hunting had grown harder. The deeper the snow became, the fewer signs of life remained, as if the land itself had gone still, holding its breath, waiting. Liam knew he had enough food for himself. His cabin was stocked, his firewood supply enough to last, but the bear needed more than he could give. She was getting restless, moving further from the den, testing her strength, and it worried him. The wound on her leg had healed, but she was still thin, still not the powerful force she should have been. She was a mother forced into weakness at the worst possible time. He knew she was reaching the point where hunger would override caution, where she would have to hunt for herself, but the world outside was still too dangerous. The wolves would come again, and this time he might not be close enough to stop them. The thought gnawed at him. He had spent his life in these woods, knew them better than he knew himself, and yet for the first time, he felt powerless. He spent his days searching for food, tracking whatever small game he could find, anything that could keep the bear strong, but it wasn't enough. And then on the 10th day after the wolves had come, he found something. A trail, not an animal's, human. The tracks were fresh, weaving between the trees in an erratic path, like someone had been moving without direction, lost or searching. Liam crouched beside them, pressing his gloved fingers to the imprint. The weight distribution was uneven, the depth of the left step heavier than the right. Someone was limping. He stood, scanning the trees, listening. The forest had always spoken to him in ways others could not hear, and right now, it was telling him he was not alone. He followed the tracks. It wasn't difficult. The person had made no effort to hide their movement, their steps desperate, breaking through the snow in jagged bursts. He moved carefully, his hand resting near the knife at his belt, not out of fear, but preparation. The wilderness was unforgiving, and a desperate man was just as dangerous as any predator. The trail led him deeper into the forest, past the ridge where the land sloped downward, where the trees grew closer together, their skeletal branches reaching for the sky. And then he saw it, a figure slumped against the base of a tree, barely visible beneath a dusting of snow, unmoving. Liam hesitated. He had not seen another person in weeks, had not spoken aloud in just as long. He wasn't sure he wanted to, but there was something familiar about the way the man was hunched, something that sent a flicker of unease crawling up his spine. Slowly, cautiously, he approached. The man was breathing, barely. His face was gaunt, skin pale from the cold, his beard patchy and unkempt. His coat was torn, one sleeve nearly ripped away entirely, exposing frost-bitten fingers curled against his chest. His left leg was twisted at an odd angle, a deep gash running down the side of his calf, crusted with frozen blood. Liam exhaled sharply. This man had been attacked, not by wolves, by something else. He knelt beside him, reaching out to shake his shoulder. The man let out a strangled groan, his eyes flickering open for only a moment before rolling back, consciousness slipping away as quickly as it had come. Liam didn't waste time. He grabbed the man beneath the arms and hauled him up, grunting under the weight. He wasn't heavy, malnourished, weak, but dragging an unconscious man through the snow was no easy task. He moved quickly, his muscles screaming in protest, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The cabin wasn't far, but every step felt like a battle against the cold, against the years of solitude that had told him people were nothing but trouble. By the time he reached the cabin, his back was drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. He kicked the door open and dragged the man inside, laying him near the fire before shutting the door behind him. The warmth hit like a wall, the contrast almost painful. He knelt beside the man, unwrapping the layers of ice-stiffened fabric, assessing the damage. The wound on his leg was deep but not fresh, infected though, and that was a problem. Liam had supplies, but he was no doctor. He worked quickly, cutting away the ruined fabric, cleaning the wound with what little antiseptic he had left. The man stirred slightly, his breath hitching, but he did not wake. Liam wrapped the leg as best he could, securing it tightly before stepping back, exhaling. The stranger was alive, for now. Hours passed. Liam sat near the fire watching the man, waiting. He told himself he should leave him be. Let him wake on his own, but the questions clawed at him. Who was he? What had attacked him? And why the hell was he out here alone? He didn't like any of the possible answers. The world outside these woods was filled with people who took what they wanted, who saw the land as something to own, to strip bare. Liam had spent years running from those people, making sure he was nothing like them. He had found peace in solitude, but now he wasn't alone. The man stirred, his breathing shifted, his fingers twitching against the blanket Liam had thrown over him. Then slowly his eyes opened. At first they were unfocused, glazed with fever and confusion, but then they locked onto Liam, and something in them cleared. Recognition. Liam's stomach twisted. He knew those eyes. Cole? The voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it hit like a hammer. Liam's blood turned to ice. He knew this man, and that meant trouble had followed. Liam's breath caught in his throat, his entire body tensing as the man's fevered gaze locked onto him. He had spent years avoiding people, carving out a life in the wilderness where no one knew his name. Yet here was someone who did. Recognition flared in those half-lidded eyes filled with exhaustion and something else. Something Liam didn't like. He swallowed hard, his mind racing through the past, trying to place the man through the haze of memories he had long since buried. The scars on his face, the rough timbre of his voice, it was all familiar, yet distant, like a ghost from a life Liam had left behind. But ghosts never stayed buried, and now one was lying half dead on his floor. Liam forced himself to move, kneeling beside the man, gripping his shoulder just hard enough to keep him from slipping back into unconsciousness. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, edged with something dangerous, something that warned against lies. The man coughed, wincing as pain lanced through him, his hand twitching toward his injured leg before falling away, too weak to do anything about it. "You don't remember me, do you?" His lips curled into something like a smirk, but there was no real humor in it. "Figures. It's been a long time." Liam said nothing, waiting. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best weapon. People hated the quiet, filled it with words, with confessions they didn't mean to give. And the man in front of him, weak and fevered, was no exception. His smirk faded, his expression growing serious, the weight of whatever had led him here settling into the lines of his face. "Name's Callum Shaw," he finally said, voice hoarse, every syllable an effort. "You and we ran together once, a long time ago." Liam's jaw clenched. The name sent a sharp jolt through his chest, a tether pulling him back to a past he had tried to outrun. He did remember. Callum had been one of them, one of the men he had once called his own, back in the days when he had followed orders without question, when survival meant taking what you could before someone else did. He had been a tracker, a man who knew the land almost as well as Liam did, and now he was here, bleeding out in Liam's home, dragging the past into the present with every labored breath. Liam stood abruptly, his mind screaming for distance, but something held him in place. Callum was injured, helpless, and no matter what sins they had shared in the past, Liam wasn't the kind of man who left the wounded to die. Not anymore. He turned to the fire, tossing another log into the flames, letting the crackling fill the silence between them. "What the hell are you doing out here?" His voice was calm, steady, but Callum wasn't fooled. He let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing weakly against the blanket. "Looking for you," he admitted. "Been tracking you for weeks. Didn't expect the wolves." Liam stiffened. He had worked hard to disappear, to make sure no one could follow him. If Callum had found him, then others could too. He turned, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Why?" Callum shifted, wincing as he tried to sit up, but Liam didn't move to help him. He needed answers first. "Because they're coming," Callum rasped, his face drawn tight with pain. "The same men we used to run with. They found something they shouldn't have, got greedy. You know how it goes. Now they're looking for a place to disappear, somewhere no one will find them. And I told them about you." A cold rage settled deep in Liam's chest, slow and lethal. He had left that life behind, had spent years atoning for the blood on his hands. And now, because of Callum, the past was coming to find him. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay still. "How many?" Callum swallowed hard. "4, maybe 5. They're desperate, Liam. Desperate men are dangerous." Liam's mind was already calculating, mapping out every path, every possible outcome. He could run, disappear again, but something stopped him. His gaze flickered toward the window, toward the snow-covered trees beyond it, toward the den, the mother bear, the cubs. He had protected them, fed them, given them a chance to survive. He couldn't just leave. He wouldn't. Callum must have seen the decision settle in his posture, because he let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Didn't think you'd run," he muttered. "Not the Liam Cole I knew." Liam didn't respond. He moved toward the cabinet near the fireplace, pulling it open to reveal a rifle and a handful of ammunition. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. He glanced back at Callum, his expression unreadable. "You brought this here. You helped me end it." Callum gave a weak nod, but Liam could see the relief in his eyes. He didn't want to run either. The hours passed in tense silence as Liam prepared. He knew these men, knew how they thought, how they moved. They would wait until nightfall, use the cover of darkness to try and slip in unnoticed. But Liam knew these woods better than they ever could. He set traps where the snow was deep enough to hide them, climbed to higher ground where he could see them coming. He was patient. He was ready. The first man appeared just past sundown, his figure little more than a shadow against the white. Liam steadied his breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He could take the shot, end it now, but he needed to see the others, needed to know how many he was up against. They moved carefully, scanning the trees, their weapons drawn. They weren't fools, but they had underestimated him. The moment the second man stepped into the trap, Liam fired. The sound cracked through the air, sending the others scrambling for cover, but it was too late. He moved like a ghost, striking from the darkness, never staying in one place long enough to be seen. Callum, still weak, took cover near the cabin, firing only when necessary. The fight was short, brutal. When it was over, Liam stood among the fallen, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales. He had not wanted this, but he had not run from it either. The snow beneath him was stained red, the bodies motionless. It was over. Liam turned, his gaze shifting toward the trees, toward the place where he knew the mother bear was watching. He had heard her just once during the fight, a deep, warning growl from the darkness. She had known somehow that the danger was not for her, but for him. He exhaled, lowering his weapon. Callum limped toward him, his expression unreadable. "Guess that means we're even," he muttered. Liam stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "Guess so." He watched as Callum turned, disappearing into the trees, back to whatever life he had left. Liam knew he wouldn't see him again. He didn't want to. He glanced back once more toward the den, then started toward his cabin, his breath curling in the cold night air. The past had come. The past had been dealt with, and for the first time in years, Liam Cole was finally free.